Why mystics practiced in silence and emptiness. We enter a room and we judge it by what we see: the furniture, the color, the art, the noise. But what if what's not in the room is the point? What if what you call empty is simply uncluttered? There is a difference between absence and invitation. An empty room is not a void, it's a frame for something else to arrive, or perhaps something ancient to emerge. We've been trained to associate fullness with meaning, to believe that space must be filled with noise, with motion, with stuff. That silence must be broken, that stillness must be fixed, that a blank wall is missing something. But the mystic knew better. They understood something we've forgotten. That presence does not require decoration. That truth does not shout. That what is most real arrives when nothing stands in its way. The room was never truly empty. It only appeared so to the eyes trained to look for distraction. In truth, the empty room is a mirror, a vessel, a sacred pause in the rhythm of existence. And what's missing in the room is not gone, it is waiting for you to stop, for you to sit, for you to notice. This is why mystics didn't seek more. They sought less, not because they lacked ambition, but because they recognized the noise of ambition was blinding them to the quiet presence already here. They entered the empty room not to escape the world, but to meet it without interference, to be with life before the name, before the task, before the self. Because in emptiness, nothing covers the sacred, nothing obscures the self, nothing separates you from what always was. This is not emptiness, it is clarity, it is intimacy. What is missing is not gone, it's what remains when you stop trying to fill the space. Most architecture is designed for activity, movement, storage, entertainment, utility. It is shaped to hold objects, bodies, events. But the empty room the mystic entered was not made to contain things. It was shaped to contain being. The walls were not barriers, they were boundaries. Sacred lines drawn to keep the outside world from leaking in. The floor didn't lead anywhere. It invited you to stay, to sit, to become still, to feel what lies beneath motion. In ordinary rooms, stillness feels awkward. You shift, you reach for a device, you speak just to fill the air. But in a sacred empty room, stillness becomes the centerpiece. You are not there to do, you are there to stop doing, to listen, to dissolve, to soften. The mystics knew that space shapes consciousness. That architecture isn't just physical, it's psychological. It creates a rhythm in the body before you even realize it. A crowded space generates speed. A chaotic space creates distraction. But a still space slows the mind. The room becomes a kind of teacher, not by speaking, but by being. The simplicity of the space asks you to meet it with your own, to put down the layers, to unclench the jaw, to exhale, to become like the room, quiet, empty, alive. It is not about minimalism. It is about intentional absence, not subtracting for the sake of aesthetic, but for the sake of presence. Because when the room holds nothing, you begin to feel what it has always held, you. And not the performing you, not the distracted you, not the version of you reflected by noise and mirrors, but the you that remains when everything else is put down. This is why the mystics sat in simple rooms with blank walls and no clocks, because nothing in the room pulled them out of themselves, and in that architecture of stillness, the real practice began. Oh. We are not afraid of silence because it is empty. We are afraid of silence because it reflects. Noise covers, words distract, motion deflects, But silence returns your gaze. It offers no explanation. It provides no escape. It simply sits with you until you begin to shift. This is what the mystics understood. That silence isn't absence, it's amplification, not of the world but of yourself. In silence, you begin to hear things that never needed to be said. Old memories you didn't file away, griefs you never gave names to, desires you hid beneath performance, and truths you can't explain but suddenly feel. That is why the mystic didn't fill the room with chants, didn't decorate the wall with symbols, didn't try to manufacture mood. The silence was the ritual. It was the place where the noise of the ego falls away and something deeper begins to emerge. Something still, something old, something you forgot you knew but recognize instantly when it rises. Because in silence, the mind has nothing to lean on. No script, no feedback, no performance. And in that discomfort, you meet the self you've avoided. But the mystic wasn't afraid of that meeting. They welcomed it. They bowed to it. They called it initiation. Because silence doesn't break you, it introduces you to your own center, to your own contradictions, to your own clarity. And over time, that mirror becomes less harsh. You stop bracing for judgment. You start recognizing the reflection, not as enemy, but as you, beneath the titles, beneath the plans, beneath the words. This is why mystics called silence sacred, not because it was holy in itself, but because it allowed the holy to arrive. The sacred doesn't need to speak loudly. It only needs space. It only needs witnessing. And silence, true silence, is the mirror that holds both. Emptiness. We say it like it's a problem, a lack, a flaw, a gap that needs to be filled. But the mystics knew. Emptiness is not a void, it's a vessel. In the modern world, we fear the empty. Empty calendars, empty inboxes, empty silence, empty rooms. Because we've been taught to measure value by what can be seen, scheduled, optimized, monetized. But what if value lies in what is held, not in what is displayed? The empty room the mystic entered was not a rejection of life. It was a container for deeper life to arrive. Like a chalice, like a bowl, like a breath before speech. Form without content isn't meaningless. It is potential. The sacred doesn't arrive in clutter. It arrives in invitation, and that invitation is made with space. That's why temples are not crammed wall to wall, why meditation halls are quiet, why Zen gardens have rocks with nothing around them. Because emptiness isn't absence, it's architecture for presence. Mystics practiced in empty rooms because they understood the subtle paradox. The less you bring in, the more you're able to receive. A room filled with noise gives you options, but a room filled with space gives you truth. Not the kind you read, the kind you feel, the kind that arrives slowly, like light in a cave, like breath after grief, like memory without words. It is the kind of truth that cannot be taught, only allowed. And only silence allows it. Only stillness welcomes it. Only emptiness is wide enough to carry the weight of something eternal. So the mystics cleared the floor. They let the light move freely. They gave the room nothing so that everything could finally come in. Not because the sacred was missing, but because it had no room to speak. And when the space was ready, when all had been let go, when even the seeker had become still, then, and only then, the silence filled the room, and it was not empty. It was whole. Oh. Most of the time, you are not alone with yourself. You are in dialogue with your to-do list, your memories, your worries, your performances. Even when the room is empty, your mind is often crowded. But the mystics understood something. The self is not what speaks the loudest. The self is what waits beneath the noise. You do not find yourself by adding more. You find yourself by removing motion, removing roles, removing the endless loop of next. Because when you take away everything that isn't essential, what remains is not a void. What remains is you. And not the you that others know, not the persona, not the function, not the voice tuned to get a response, but the silent core, the quiet presence, the simple awareness that just is. The mystics entered the empty room not to escape the world, but to strip away its costumes, to peel off the layers of identity, opinion, reputation, and sit with whatever was left. That sitting was not passive, it was radical. Because in a world that rewards performance, to stop performing is a kind of rebellion. To sit in a room with no purpose and no one watching is to face the question, who am I when I am not being seen? And in the silence that follows that question, the real self begins to glow, not as an answer, but as a presence. You don't become someone new. You become someone honest. You see the part of you that was never trying to impress, never trying to achieve, never trying to survive the noise. It was simply being beneath all the trying. And in that space, something shifts. The breath deepens, the muscles release, the thoughts slow down, not by force, but because they are no longer being chased. This is the moment mystics waited for. Not enlightenment, not ecstasy, not fireworks. Just presence, naked, silent, true. The room is empty, the noise is gone, and what remains is not a concept but you. It's easy to misunderstand the mystic. We see them step into silence, step away from the world, and we call it retreat, withdrawal, escape. But we're projecting, because we think the world is where reality happens, and silence is where it disappears. The mystic knew better. They didn't run away from life. They stepped into a deeper version of it, one without distraction, without performance, without interruption. The empty room wasn't a refusal of reality. It was a doorway into it. The noise we call life is often just surface. The notifications, the loops, the rushing, they blur the edges of who we are and what we feel. And so the mystics stripped it away, not because they were weak, but because they were ready. Ready to meet the part of life that only arrives when the lights dim, when the room stills, when the self has nowhere left to hide. In silence, you're not avoiding your life. You're being initiated into it. And initiation is always a little frightening. Because it's not about learning something new, it's about remembering something old, something you forgot you carried. The empty room doesn't soothe you, it exposes you, and then it holds you. It doesn't offer distractions, it offers presence, pure, undiluted, uncomfortable. But inside that discomfort, a portal opens. Not out of the world, but deeper into it. You begin to feel things more vividly, your breath, your body, the ache of truth you've kept beneath the surface. And you begin to realize you were never running from the world. You were running from meeting it fully. The mystic knew this. They didn't go to the empty room to disappear. They went there to reappear, to strip away the layers of name and need and return to the world with clarity. Not blank, but clear. Not void of identity, but full of essence. The empty room wasn't the end of their path, it was the threshold. They stepped into it, to remember what the world had made them forget, and they stepped back out, carrying a silence that nothing could shake. The world doesn't change just because you sit in silence. The traffic continues, the politics escalate, the deadlines pile, the noise persists. But you change, and that changes everything. This is the paradox the mystic understood. Silence doesn't fix the world. It recalibrates your place inside it. When you walk out of the empty room, nothing looks different, but nothing feels the same. Colors feel closer, voices feel louder, time slows, the ordinary becomes holy. Because the silence doesn't stay in the room, it follows you. It lingers like incense. It echoes like a bell long after it's rung. And it changes how you listen, how you speak, how you see people, how you see yourself. Before, you lived in reaction. Now, you respond from a deeper place. Before, the world pulled you. Now, you walk through it, still, anchored. This is what the mystics knew. The silence wasn't a destination, it was a return to your center, to your rhythm, to your breath. So when the noise returns, and it will, you are not swept away. You are aware. Not immune, but intimate. Because now you know where the ground is. You've touched it, sat with it, became still enough to let it rise up and hold you. That's why mystics were calm in chaos. Not because they didn't feel, but because they knew how to return to that space even with eyes open. Even in conversation, even in conflict. They carried the room with them because the room was never really outside, it was always within. The walls just made it easier to find. The silence gave it space. The stillness gave it form. But once you know it, once you've entered that deep quiet, you can hear it anywhere. Even now, even here. Most people speak to be heard. Mystics sat in stillness to listen to what cannot be spoken. Because long before words, long before thought, long before civilization shaped language into sentences, there was stillness. And it communicated. Not in syllables, but in weight, in rhythm, in presence. Stillness is not absence of action, it is a language of the soul. And once you begin to hear it, you realize it's been speaking to you your entire life. In moments of awe, in grief so large it silences the room. In love so full it makes you forget what to say. In beauty so sharp it breaks through your mind and settles into your chest. Stillness says, "This is real. You don't need to explain it." Mystics knew this. That's why they weren't in a rush to preach, or convert, or speak at all. Because some truths arrive only in the pause. And when you fill the space with words too early, you miss what was forming beneath them. That's why the empty room matters. Not because it's dramatic, but because it speaks in a dialect that only stillness understands. It doesn't deliver answers. It delivers clarity, not conclusions, but reverence. And reverence is not loud. It leans in, it bows, it listens. And in that listening, something sacred unfolds. Stillness reminds you that you were not made for constant reaction. You were made to respond from the depth of awareness. You were made not just to speak, but to hold space, to let the moment be what it is before rushing to shape it. Because when you begin to treat silence as a language, you stop fearing it. You begin to notice its subtleties, its tones, its textures, its timing. You start to feel what another person is saying, even when they say nothing. You start to understand that many of the most honest things you've ever felt were silent. And now you no longer need to fill the room, because the room speaks too, and you're finally fluent in its language. At first, the mystic enters a physical space, a monastery, a cave, a temple, a room with white walls and no windows. But over time, they begin to realize the room was never just a room. It was a reflection, a symbol, a mirror turned inward. Because the true sanctuary isn't made of stone or silence, it's made of attention. And the longer one sits in stillness, the more obvious it becomes. You are not seeking a place, you are uncovering a presence. Not somewhere far away, not even somewhere within, but something that was never separate from you. The empty room outside is just practice for finding the empty room within. And in that inner room, the same rules apply. No noise, no expectation, no furniture made of thought. Just space, stillness, awareness. And that awareness, it begins to gather. It begins to glow, not with effort, but with simple witnessing. That's the shift, from seeker to seer, from trying to understand, to simply being with what's already true. The mystic sits not to escape the world, but to realize they carry a temple in their breath, a cathedral in their consciousness, a stillness so whole it needs no door. This is what the empty room teaches, not just that silence is sacred, but that you are. That you don't have to go anywhere to arrive. You only have to stop long enough to see you've always been here. And when you realize that, the whole world becomes a room. Every conversation becomes a space. Every breath, a ritual. Every still moment, a threshold. Because once you discover the room within you, carry it everywhere. And no matter where you go, you are home. We often fear emptiness. It looks like failure, like absence, like something went wrong. A blank page, a silent room, a space with no shape. We call it nothing, but the mystics knew better. Emptiness is not the end of something, it's the beginning of everything. Because form doesn't emerge from fullness, it emerges from space. A sculpture begins with untouched stone. A symphony begins with silence. A word begins with breath. The sacred doesn't erupt from chaos, it arises from clarity. And clarity is born in stillness, in simplicity, in emptiness that precedes form. Mystics didn't sit in quiet rooms to deny the world. They sat there to remember where form is born. They weren't running from creation, they were returning to its source. And what is the source? Stillness, space, silence. Not passive silence, but alive silence, pregnant with potential. That's why the empty room matters. It isn't an endpoint, it's an altar for what's to come. It invites, it doesn't demand. It holds your attention like a seed holds a tree quietly, completely, invisibly. You walk into it expecting nothing, and yet something begins to form. Ideas, not forced but revealed. Feelings, not chased but welcomed. Visions, not projected but received. Because when you stop trying to control the form, you create the condition for it to arise naturally. This is why mystics trusted emptiness. They knew it was creative. It wasn't sterile, it was fertile. Not dead space, but the space that births everything worth calling real. So they returned to it again and again, to sit, to breathe, to become empty enough for truth to take shape. And when the time came to speak, to move, to act, they did so not from reaction, but from resonance. Not from habit, but from alignment with something deeper than desire. They weren't trying to make form. They were letting it emerge. Because once you've touched true emptiness, you stop filling space out of fear. You begin to create only what matters. At first, you sit in the room, then you sit with the room, but eventually, you become the room. The separation dissolves. There's no longer a wall between inside and outside, no longer a you meditating and a space around you. There is only this presence, silent, vast, indivisible. Mystics knew this wasn't just stillness, it was merging, a quiet dissolution of all that divides. You are not thinking about silence, you are the silence. Not witnessing stillness, you are the stillness. Not occupying the room, but being the room itself. And in that merging, something profound occurs. The self that needed to manage, to narrate, to explain, falls quiet. Not because it's silenced, because it's fulfilled. There is nothing to prove in the empty room. There is nothing to perform, nothing to accomplish. So you let go of being seen, of being heard, of being anyone other than the open field of awareness itself. This is not detachment. This is belonging at the deepest level. The mystics called this prayer, not the kind with words, but the kind with breath. A prayer of being, of presence, of still communion with what cannot be named. And the miracle is, you don't have to chase this moment. You only have to stop long enough for it to arrive. Like mist, like light, like memory. So you sit, not to achieve, but to dissolve. And what remains is not nothing. It is not absence. It is everything without the need to grasp it. You become the room because the room was always you. The silence you feared becomes the silence that heals. The space you avoided becomes the space that reveals. The stillness you resisted becomes the stillness that remembers you before you forgot yourself. And when you rise from that room, you do not leave it behind. You carry it in the way you walk, in the way you see, in the way you listen. Because once you have become the room, you bring it with you into the world. And wherever you are, silence arrives too.